Our tale from Trench Crusade today takes us to New Antioch, to the story of Yusuf al-Rashid, a 25-year-old reconnaissance soldier, 3 years into a war that had already taken everything he had except one thing worth fighting for. He was not a hero. He was a young man with a rifle and one bullet, watching the world tear open above an altar of gold. The silence held. The briefing was short, which was how Lieutenant Ferris preferred it. We assembled in the basement of the quartermaster's building, 8 men in a low room that smelled of lamp oil and old stone, and Ferris stood at the map table with his hands flat on the oilcloth and told us what the Duke's intelligence people had decided we needed to know. That Heretic warbands had been moving through no man's land for 3 nights running. That they were searching for something, or preparing something. The scouts who'd spotted them hadn't been close enough to say which. That our job was to go out, observe, and if the opportunity presented itself, disrupt. He didn't use words like opportunity often. He was a plain man, in most respects. Mid-30s, a flat face with a nose broken twice in the field rather than in brawls, and the kind of stillness about him that the men read as competence, and the officers above him probably read as stubbornness. He'd been my commanding officer for 14 months, and I'd watched him make decisions in bad situations, the kind of decisions where the wrong choice got men killed. And he made them with a steadiness that I had never been able to entirely account for. He had a wife in New Antioch. 2 daughters, I thought, though I wasn't certain. He never spoke about them the way some officers did, pulling the family out like a tool to build rapport with the men. When he mentioned them, it was in passing, almost by accident, as though they were simply part of the world he assumed you already knew about. Mouse was beside me with his elbows on his knees and his chin on his hands, watching Faris with the particular expression he wore when he was paying close attention and didn't want anyone to know it. His real name was Edouard Delacroix, which was what the duty roster said and what Faris called him when it mattered. Everyone else called him Mouse. He was small, not merely short, but small in the way of a man whose body had economized on every dimension, and quick in all the ways that counted. He'd grown up in the Levantine quarter of New Antioch, which explained the Arabic he mixed into his French when he was tired, and he had a dark sense of humor that I had come to rely on without ever quite admitting it. 3 days out of 5, I woke to the sound of him already awake, cleaning something or sharpening something, talking quietly to no one in particular about the general stupidity of the world. I had not had a friend since before my parents died. I was not sure I would have called Mouse a friend if you'd asked me directly, but I felt his absence like a pulled tooth when he wasn't there. Ferris was pointing at the map. 3 possible crossing routes. He'd picked the middle one, longer, muddier, but it kept us away from the drainage channels where heretic patrols had been observed. He'd assigned fields of observation along our projected route. He'd worked out our signals and our fallback points with the kind of methodical care that meant he'd been thinking about this since morning. Nothing about the briefing suggested urgency. Nothing suggested that the Duke's intelligence had any particular stake in the night's outcome beyond the routine management of the line. I looked at the map and thought about the timing. 3 nights of heretic movement. 3 consecutive nights, which meant something was building. I didn't say it because Ferris already knew it. After he dismissed us, I went up to the roof of the quartermaster's building and stood in the dark and looked at the city. New Antioch does not look like a fortress from the inside. From the inside, it looks like a city, 300 years of buildings pressed together, the old Crusader stone of the great cathedral and the administrative buildings, the Levantine arcades along the market streets, the churches and the minarets that had been converted to bell towers when the Sultan's line had converted 3 generations back and given their faith to the Crusade. 300 years of faith and building and children born inside those walls and buried inside them. At night, the bells rang in sequence, a pattern so ingrained in the city's rhythms that you stopped hearing it within a week of arrival. I had been inside these walls for 2 years and 8 months, and I heard the bells constantly, even in my sleep, the way you hear your own heartbeat. The silence held. The walls themselves were another matter. I could see the nearest section from the roof, torchlight along the parapet, the silhouettes of the watch moving in their rounds, the dark mass of the stone itself that was thicker than a man was tall at its thinnest point, and had been maintained and repaired and reinforced every year since its founding. They said the walls of New Antioch had never been breached. Not in 300 years of the long war, not through the worst of what the heretic legions had thrown at them. The people inside believed this the way they believed in the faith itself, as a fact too fundamental to require examination. I thought about Nadia. She was 16, which meant she had been 13 when I left home, and 25 when I calculated it honestly, which I did rarely. She was living with distant cousins, my mother's cousin's family, people I had met twice as a child and knew only through letters, in a tenement in the Levantine quarter, which was the part of the city where rent was manageable on what I sent her. I sent her most of my pay. Not all of it. I needed to eat, and I needed to be able to maintain my kit, but most. She was studying, the last letter had said. She was learning to read French as well as Arabic. She had made a friend named Dilnoza, who was from the eastern provinces, and who Nadia described with the careful enthusiasm of someone trying to seem older than they were. She would have been asleep by now. That was the thing I held on to, standing on the roof with the bells marking the 3rd hour of the night and the dark mass of no man's land invisible beyond the walls, but present the way a sound just below hearing is present. Nadia asleep in her bed in the Levantine quarter. That was the thing. I went back down and checked my rifle. It was a standard-issue bolt action, the kind the army had been producing in New Antioch's workshops for 40 years. Nothing holy about it. Nothing blessed. The sniper priests who anchored the defensive lines used weapons that were instruments of faith as much as precision. They shot by something other than sight, by a communion with the divine that I was too new to this path and too uncertain in myself to claim. I had been told by the man who was teaching me that faith was not a feeling but a practice, and that the practice would build the feeling over time, and that patience was the first discipline of the sniper as well as the first discipline of the saint. I was working on patience. In the meantime, I had a bolt-action rifle with standard iron sights and 12 rounds in my belt, and the knowledge that I could reliably hit a man-sized target at 200 meters if the conditions were decent, and I took my time. Ferris led us out through the sally port at the 4th hour of the night. The transition from inside the walls to outside them was something you never grew accustomed to, not entirely. I had made this crossing dozens of times, and each time there was a moment, stepping through the narrow gate and onto the ground beyond, where my body registered the change before my mind did. The air was different. It was not merely colder or damper, though it was both. It was the quality of attention and that the world paid you. Inside the walls, you were within something that had been held against the darkness for 3 centuries. Outside them, you were meat. We moved in single file with 2 meters between each man, following Faris by the dim red light of the hooded lantern on his belt. And we did not speak. The ground was already soft within 50 meters of the walls. The drainage from the trenches and the constant movement of boots and cartwheels had churned the earth into a consistency that sucked at your feet and released them reluctantly, so that every step required a small, deliberate extraction. The mud of New Antioch's immediate environs was a known quantity. You learned to lift your feet higher than felt natural and to place them flat rather than heel first, and after a while the technique became habitual. The silence held. No man's land proper began at the remains of what had been a village 300 years ago, before the first siege. Now it was a series of low stone mounds and the outlines of foundations and a single wall fragment that stood chest-high and was used as a navigation point by both sides. We called it the Nun's Wall, though no one knew why. I passed it in the dark and felt its mass without seeing it, a presence at my left shoulder, and then we were in the open ground. I have tried to describe no man's land to people who have not been in it, and I have not managed it satisfactorily. The physical description is easy enough. Craters, most of them old enough to have taken on water, rims of churned earth that had hardened into irregular ridges. Unexploded ordnance half buried in the mud, shells that had failed to detonate and sat there rusting, waiting with the patience of inert things, occasionally going off when a boot found them wrong, occasionally going off for no reason at all. The ruins of structures that no longer had names because no one alive remembered what they had been. Tangles of rusted wire, the skeletal remainders of trees. The smell was a particular thing. Not the smell of rot, exactly, though rot was part of it. Old rot. The rot of things that had been decomposing for so long they had become indistinguishable from the soil itself. A sweetness beneath the mineral coldness of the mud that you learned to stop noticing because noticing it too closely reminded you of what you were walking through. Under that was something else, something that had no natural source, a faint metallic sharpness, like copper on the back of the tongue, that the sniper priest said was the residue of the heretic's workings seeping upward through the ground. 3 centuries of corrupted ritual leached into the earth. You breathed it with every step. The sounds were wrong, too. No man's land at night was not silent. There was always distant artillery, the dull concussions from the northern sectors where the line was more active. A sound so persistent, it became a kind of silence itself. There were the small noises of the ground, water settling in craters, the shift of rubble cooling as the temperature dropped, the occasional creak of old timber in the ruins. But beneath those sounds, threading between them, there was an absence. No insects, no small animals moving in the dark. Nothing living in the ordinary sense had established itself here, not in 3 centuries of constant death and worse than death. And the silence left by that absence was the silence of a place that had been excised from the world's normal processes and not yet replaced with anything. I kept my eyes on the boots of the man ahead of me, and I breathed through my mouth, and I lifted my feet with care. But the physical description misses the quality of the place. You felt in no man's land that the ground itself remembered things. The earth had absorbed so much violence over 3 centuries. So much blood. So much fire. So much of the specific wrongness that attended the heretic's works, that it had become something other than simple earth. The sniper priests said that the souls of the dead lingered where they had fallen, caught between what they had been and whatever came after, unable to resolve their last moment. I was not certain I believed in such things in any specific theological sense, but I had seen things in no man's land. The silence held. 3 months earlier, I had been crossing alone, returning from an observation post, when I had seen a figure moving through the dark about 30 meters to my left. Moving wrong, not quite the right gait, the head turning too often, the arms swinging out of phase with the legs. I had stopped and watched it. It had moved past me without changing course and disappeared into a crater, and I had not followed it. And when I'd mentioned it to Mouse, he had nodded without looking up from what he was doing, and said that the place was thick with them, and the trick was to not make eye contact, which I was fairly certain he'd invented on the spot. But I had checked with the priest who served the garrison chapel, and he had said, without particular ceremony, that yes, the trench ghosts were real, that they were remnant souls still fighting their last battle, still moving through the last moment of their lives in an endless repetition, and that they were harmless to the living unless you engaged with them, at which point things could become complicated. That night, somewhere between the nun's wall and the first fire site, I saw 2 of them. Not clearly. You never saw them clearly, which may have been a mercy. At the periphery of my vision, in the space between my position and the dark bulk of a flooded crater 30 meters west, something moved with that particular wrong gait. Then another, further away barely distinguishable from the night. They moved on paths that had nothing to do with the terrain. Straight lines through rubble that should have blocked them, through the standing water that should have slowed them, as though the physical world was a memory they were passing through rather than a reality they inhabited. I kept my eyes forward. I kept moving. The dead of no man's land were not my problem tonight. I did not look left. I kept my eyes on the back of the man ahead of me, and I lifted my feet, and I moved forward. We found the first sign of recent heretic activity about 400 meters out. Ferris crouched, and the line went still behind him, and he studied something in the mud, with his lantern shuttered to a hair of light. A fire site, cold ash, and the remnants of something that had been burned in the fire that was not wood. The ash had a quality to it, a texture and a faint iridescence that I did not want to examine closely. Around the fire site, pressed into the mud where the ground was softer, were symbols. Not words in any script I recognized. Geometric shapes that had been drawn with precision, precise, for the middle of no man's land at night, which meant they had been drawn by someone with time and purpose. Mouse came up beside me and looked at the symbols for a moment and then looked at Ferris. Ferris looked at the symbols and said nothing. He took out a small notebook, he always carried one, and sketched the symbols by touch more than sight, then gestured us forward. There were 3 more fire sites over the next hour. Each time we stopped. Each time Ferris sketched. Each time we moved on. The pattern of the sites suggested a path, not our path, but a parallel one, moving in the same general direction. Whatever the heretics had been doing out here, they had been doing it methodically, working along a line. I was thinking about the pattern when the flare went up. It came from our right, without warning, a burst of white light that turned the world flat and shadowless for 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds I saw everything, our formation, the ground around us, and 30 meters to our right, already oriented toward us, a heretic patrol of 6 men. Ferris said 1 word and we scattered. I went left, because left was the only direction that had cover. A line of craters, old and water-filled, with a low ridge between them. I dropped into the shadow of the ridge and pressed flat, and heard the shooting start behind me. Short bursts, disciplined. Not a firefight, an encounter, each side trying to break contact. I counted my breathing. I counted the shots. When the shooting stopped, I counted another 30 before I lifted my head. The ground around me was empty. The flare had died. Somewhere in the dark, there were still 7 men from my platoon, but I could see none of them, and I could not call out to find them. The silence held. I moved. The sensible thing to do was to find the fallback point that Ferris had designated, but the fallback point was 800 meters behind us, and reaching it meant crossing open ground I didn't know well in the dark with a heretic patrol of unknown disposition somewhere to my right. I chose to move forward instead, toward the ruins Ferris had marked on the map as our observation target. I told myself it was tactical thinking. It was probably just that forward felt safer than backward in that moment, which is not something I would have admitted to Ferris. I moved for perhaps 20 minutes through the dark and the mud, and found myself at the edge of a rubble field, a dense collection of collapsed stone buildings that had once, judging by the scale of the foundations, been a significant settlement. Nothing left now but walls at varying stages of collapse, floors that had become rubble, and a series of open spaces where the buildings had fallen inward on themselves. I worked my way in from the western edge, moving slowly and testing each step. The upper floor of the building I chose was accessible by a staircase that was missing every other tread, which meant it had survived because no one had bothered to dismantle it. The floor above was half collapsed, but there was a section near the north wall that held. Through a gap in the outer wall, at the level of my chest when I knelt, I could see down into what had been the central courtyard of the settlement, a cleared space about 30 meters across, bounded by the remains of walls on 3 sides. It had good lines of sight in all directions. I took stock. I had my rifle. I had my kit. I counted my rounds. 1. I had fired more than I thought in the confusion after the flare. I must have. I counted again, methodically, going through each pouch and pocket. 1 round. The mathematics of the situation were clear, and not in my favor. I was alone in no man's land with unknown forces between me and the walls, with 1 bullet in a rifle that was otherwise a heavy stick, and a heretic warband of unknown size, somewhere in the ruins around me. I lay down on what remained of the floor, put my back against the north wall, and waited for dawn. It came slowly. The sky lightened from black to gray to a thin, cold blue, and in the growing light I looked down into the courtyard and understood that I would not be leaving through it. The heretics were already there. Not a patrol. Not a scouting party. I counted 30 before I stopped counting individual figures and started counting categories. Wretched moving in their peculiar, half-controlled manner at the edges of the courtyard. I could see the brandings on their faces and hands, even at this distance, the cursed tattoos that mapped their humiliation in lines of scar tissue. Heretic infantry in their degraded armor, the kind that had been captured or scavenged and modified to express allegiance rather than function. Robed figures who moved with more deliberation. Their paths through the courtyard not random but purposeful, as though they were making preparations, and more arriving through the gaps in the outer walls, in small groups, with the unhurried manner of men who knew where they were going and expected to be there for a while. I did not move. I breathed. This was something the man teaching me the sniper's discipline had said, that the first lesson was not how to shoot, but how to be still. A man who is still cannot be seen by anything that is not already looking at him. A man who is still can observe. Observation is more valuable than action in most circumstances because action requires certainty and observation builds it. I was working on stillness the same way I was working on patience. I had not mastered it, but I was still. Through the morning, the numbers in the courtyard grew. By the time the sun was fully up, there were perhaps 60 figures below me, and I had mapped their positions as best I could from my angle. I had noted the entry points, 3 gaps in the outer walls, one larger than the others on the southern side. I had noted where the robed figures spent most of their time, which was near the center of the courtyard where the ground was flattest. I had noted that there were wretched moving in loose patrol routes around the outer perimeter of the building complex, which meant that leaving through the back of my building would bring me within meters of them. I thought about leaving anyway. The silence held. I could slip down the stairs and through the back rooms and probably get 50 meters before one of the perimeter wretched found me. 50 meters into the open ground beyond the building, with 1 bullet against 60-plus heretic soldiers. I stayed. It was around mid-morning when I decided to try the back anyway. Not the full escape, just a reconnaissance of the route, to know whether it was possible if I needed it. I left my rifle against the wall. Taking it through the tight spaces of the lower floor would slow me, and its bulk would give me away where silence would not, and moved down the staircase and through the interior. The lower floor was a series of connected rooms, the walls between them partially or fully collapsed, the floors covered in a mixture of old rubble and newer mud. I moved slowly, checking each opening before passing through it. The smell down here was different from upstairs, damper, more enclosed, and underneath the usual mineral smell of old stone there was something organic, recent. The heretics had been through these rooms. Someone had eaten in the second room. There were the remnants of a fire in the corner, a scatter of bones, too small to identify, and the ash had that same faint iridescence I had seen in the fire sites across the open ground. I did not stop to examine it. I moved on. In the 4th room from the back I found what I'd been dreading. A wretched, standing in the shadow of a collapsed interior wall, facing away from me. I stopped. It hadn't heard me, or hadn't reacted yet, which might be the same thing. The drugging the heretics used on their branded soldiers degraded the higher functions, while leaving the aggressive responses intact, which meant their reactions were sometimes delayed, but, when they came, were uncontrolled. I stood very still and studied it. It was shorter than average, which meant nothing. The wretched were drawn from whatever the heretics could take. Its branded hands hung at its sides. The cursed marks ran from the back of its wrists up the visible portion of its forearms, the lines of scar tissue raised and thickened where the branding had gone deep, and between the scars the skin had a grayish cast, the color of something that had been indoors too long. Its breathing was slow and irregular. Not asleep. Suspended, maybe. The way the drugged sometimes entered a state that was neither sleep nor waking, a maintenance mode, waiting for the stimulus that would bring them back to full function. I waited a long moment, measuring the distance to the next room opening. 8 feet. The floor between us was rubble and compacted mud. Nothing I could cross in silence. It turned. I don't know what triggered it. Some shift in the air. Some sound I'd made, without knowing. Its eyes found me, and it did not pause to assess or consider. It came at me with its hands out, the branded fingers reaching, making the low sound in its throat that the wretched make when they are locked onto something. I had maybe 2 seconds. I could not fire. There were heretic soldiers on the other side of the outer wall, less than 10 meters away. One shot would bring them all down on me before the body was cold. I used the knife. The silence held. It was not clean or quick or anything like the training made it sound. The training described angles and targets and the mechanics of what the body would do when those targets were reached, and the training was not wrong, but it described the action from the outside rather than from within it. And from within it, the dominant facts were different. The dominant facts were: The wretched's hands found my collar before I had the knife clear of the sheath, and its grip was the grip of something that didn't know its own strength or didn't care, the branded fingers locked with a mechanical certainty. The dominant fact was the sound it was making in its throat, low and sustained and not quite human, and the effort of keeping my left hand over its mouth to prevent that sound from rising into something the soldiers outside could hear. The dominant fact was that it did not stop when it should have stopped, because the drugging removed the part of the nervous system that responds to pain as a signal to disengage. It only responded to incapacity, to the body's function ceasing entirely. And so I had to work in silence, in a space barely large enough to move in, with the sounds of the Heretic camp on the other side of a single wall of crumbling stone, and with my own breathing too loud in my ears, and the knife doing what the knife needed to do, and the whole business taking far longer than I would have believed possible. When it was finally over, I stood in the dark and shook for a moment. The shaking was fine. It was the body doing what the body does when you ask it to be very controlled for a sustained period and then stop asking. I gave it its moment. Then I dragged the body into the corner and covered it with rubble as best I could and wiped my hands on a section of the wretched's clothing and stood up straight and breathed slowly until my hands were steady. They were not entirely steady when I got back to the upper floor. I picked up my rifle and held it and breathed until they were. The escape route through the back was closed. The wretched were on the perimeter in numbers. I had confirmed what I should have accepted an hour ago. I was not leaving this building until the situation in the courtyard changed. I settled back against the north wall and watched. In the early afternoon, the sound of chains reached me before anything else. A rhythmic grinding, deep and metallic. The links of something far heavier than a standard trace chain working under load, punctuated by the creak of something massive under structural stress. Wood bending at the limits of its tolerance, iron fittings taking weight they had not been designed for. And under that, the sound of many feet moving in coordinated labor, the shuffling, synchronized tread of things that moved together because they had been made to move together. I pressed closer to the gap in the wall and looked. The wretched in the courtyard had moved. They had arranged themselves on either side of the southern opening without instruction, in two lines, facing inward, their heads bowed. The robed figures had stepped back from the center of the courtyard. The air in the open space had changed. The temperature had shifted, a warmth reaching me at my height and distance that had no source I could yet see. A smell arrived with the warmth. Copper, intense and close. The smell of hot metal, and beneath it something sweeter and more wrong that I could not identify, and didn't try to name. Then it came through the southern opening, the large one, and it was bigger than I had imagined anything the heretics might bring into no man's land could be. The silence held. The golden calf war altar was perhaps 4 meters tall at the top of the idol and 6 meters long on its iron platform, which was mounted on wooden wheels bound with iron and moved on chains gripped by teams of 30 wretched, 15 to a side. The chains were as thick as a man's forearm, each link hammered from iron that had been worked in patterns I did not recognize, marks pressed into the metal at intervals, the same geometric precision as the symbols in the fire sites, the marks of dedication, running the entire length of every chain, 30 feet of consecrated iron on each side pulling the altar forward at a walking pace through the rubble and mud of the courtyard floor. The wretched pulling the chains were silent. They leaned into the load with a coordination that was not cooperation. They did not look at one another, did not signal, did not adjust. They simply pulled in the same rhythm because the rhythm had been placed in them and could not be removed. The idol itself was a calf, or rather the idea of a calf rendered in beaten gold, so thick that the metal had its own weight and warmth. The musculature of the animal exaggerated in ways that made it wrong. The proportions slightly off in ways that I couldn't identify, but that my eyes kept catching. The legs were too long below the knee. The neck was set at an angle that no living animal achieved. The rib cage was too visible, the ribs counting wrong through the gold, one too many or one too few. I tried to count them, and my eyes slid away each time, refusing to complete the arithmetic. The gold itself was not the yellow bright gold of new metal. It was deeper, older looking, with a warmth that went beyond color into something that felt almost like temperature at the distance I was observing it. As though the gold itself was not merely warm from the fire within, but warm in the way that living things are warm, from the inside out. The mouth was open. That was the thing about the mouth. It was open, and from within it came not light, but the absence of shadow, a radiance that did not illuminate but displaced, so that the air around the altar was different to the air elsewhere in ways I could see but not describe. Objects near the altar cast shadows in the wrong directions. The light from the soldiers' torches bent slightly as it approached the altar's immediate environs, curving in ways that torchlight did not curve, as though the altar were a stone dropped in still water and the light were the surface disturbed by the impact. The heat was the second thing. Even at my height and distance I felt it, not the heat of a fire which has direction and source. This was ambient, the way summer ground radiates stored heat at night, coming from the altar itself, from the gold, from whatever burned inside it that was not visible to me. I could feel it on my face and on the back of my hands where they rested on the wall. A dry heat, not the wet heat of combustion. Something older and more patient than fire. The heretic priest came with it. He walked beside the altar as it was maneuvered into the center of the courtyard, and he was tall, taller than any man I'd seen in the camp, which already contained large men. And he moved with the particular deliberate ease of someone who is accustomed to having space made for them. His robes were black and copper. The copper worked in patterns across the black in a style I associated with the higher grades of heretic clergy, men who had given more of themselves over to their service than the ordinary soldiers. His face I could not see clearly at this distance. His hands I could see. They were bare, and he used them to direct the placement of the altar with a series of short, precise gestures, and the wretched responded to his directions with a mechanical accuracy that suggested something other than understanding. They did not look at his hands. They moved when he moved, as though the gesture communicated itself through the air between them without requiring observation. I looked at his robes, at the things attached to them, patches and strips of material, sewn or pinned to the fabric in no obvious pattern. I assumed they were trophies from taken prisoners or looted positions. This was not uncommon among heretic clergy who had seen significant field service. The silence held. He directed the altar into position. His circle of lesser priests, 4 of them, in less elaborate versions of the same robes, began working the ground around it. They chalked symbols onto the cleared stone and earth of the courtyard, working outward from the altar's base, connecting new patterns to the existing ones I'd noticed earlier. Iron braziers were placed at intervals and lit with something that burned too blue to be ordinary fuel. The chanting began low and almost below hearing, a rhythm that I felt in my chest before I identified it as sound. A vibration that the walls of my building transmitted upward through the stone and into the floor beneath me and into my body where it lay against that floor. Not pleasant, not painful, simply present, the way the city bells were present, a rhythm imposed on the world from outside, insisting on its own regularity. The day wore down. I did not sleep. I ate the ration block I carried and drank a measured amount from my canteen, and I did not sleep. The chanting was continuous, the pitch and rhythm varying in patterns I could not identify, but that seemed to mark stages in whatever preparation was underway. I watched the priest and his circle. I watched the wretched on the perimeter. I thought about Nadia. I thought about her a lot that day, more than usual. There was a quality to the waiting, the enforced stillness, the knowledge that I could not act, the sound of the chanting that had no pause, that kept turning my mind toward her the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth. Not morbidly, not with the particular weight of a man thinking about what he is leaving behind. More like checking. She is there. She is safe. The walls are standing. As long as those things are true, what is happening in this courtyard has a boundary. I thought about her letter, the one about Dilnoza, about the French lessons. I thought about the handwriting, which I had not seen since before my parents died, and which was a different handwriting now, a young woman's rather than a child's, the letters more regular and deliberate. I thought about what she was becoming inside those walls while I was outside them, and I did not allow myself to think past the walls to what was building below me in the courtyard. I kept the boundary clear. She is there. She is safe. That was the thing. It was at dusk, when the light had gone flat and gray and the shadows of the courtyard walls had merged with the general dark, that the prisoners arrived. They came through the eastern gap in the outer walls, pushed along by wretched handlers, 9 of them with their hands bound behind them and strips of cloth tied over their mouths. I watched them being herded into the courtyard and positioned in a line facing the altar. And I was clinical about my assessment of them for approximately 10 seconds, which was how long it took me to recognize Faris. I knew him by his build, by the way he held his shoulders. Even with his hands bound and his face half obscured, there was something in his posture that was recognizably his. The particular way he held himself upright that was not quite military straightness, but something more innate, a stubbornness in the spine. He was looking at the altar. I could not read his expression. The others, a man and a woman in civilian clothing, merchant quality, which meant they had been taken on the road between settlements. 4 men in rougher clothes, who might have been laborers or farmers or off-duty soldiers out of uniform. 1 older man in the robes of a minor priest, which explained why he was here. The heretics had use for consecrated blood. And 2 younger men, whose faces I did not recognize but whose bearing suggested military training. 9 prisoners. 1 bullet. I did not allow myself to complete the calculation that began in my mind. I put it down the way you put down a weight you've been carrying too long, and deliberately breathe through the setting down. I watched. I was still. Patience is the first discipline. The ritual began at full dark. The silence held. The chanting changed, the rhythm accelerating, the pitch rising, the 4 lesser priests moving in a prescribed pattern around the altar, while the heretic priest stood at its head with his back to me and his arms at his sides, very still, in the way that stillness means readiness rather than rest. The golden calf's mouth brightened. The radiance that was not quite light intensified, and the heat increased with it, and the air above the altar began to have a quality I had no good word for. Tension, maybe. The way the air feels before lightning. A pressure that had no physical direction. The lesser priests marked the prisoners with something as they passed down the line. A gesture, a touch to the forehead, a mark in ash or charcoal. The prisoners did not resist. The older priest, the one in religious robes, kept his eyes closed throughout. One of the laborers was shaking badly enough that the movement was visible at my distance. Faris did not close his eyes. He watched the priest and his circle with that same steady attention he gave to maps and briefings, filing what he saw, looking for the information that would be useful. The first prisoner was a man, the older priest, the one in religious robes. They brought him to the altar, and I watched what was done, and I will describe it only as what was done was enough to silence the chanting briefly, because even the heretic priests seemed to need a moment. The golden calf's mouth went brighter. I pressed my forehead against the cold stone of the wall and breathed. The cold was grounding. The stone was real and old and had been part of this world for 3 centuries, and it was real under my forehead, and I breathed against it and counted. I counted the remaining prisoners, 8. I counted my round, 1. The arithmetic had not changed. A single shot would accomplish nothing except my own death before anyone else could be saved, and my death here, alone and unwitnessed, would be a fact that not even Nadia would know for months. I breathed. I was still. I watched. The ritual continued in stages that I understood only as sequences. The lesser priests moved in their prescribed pattern. The chanting built to a peak after each prisoner was brought forward, and then settled back to its base frequency, climbing again in the intervals between. The golden calf's mouth glow changed quality with each iteration, warmer to colder, the honey gold of banked fire shifting towards something that had less warmth in it and more intensity. The way the color of a flame changes when it burns hotter. 2 more prisoners over the course of the next hour. The radiance from the altar's mouth had gone from warm gold to something colder and more intense, and the air above it had begun to behave strangely. Currents moving against the wind, heat shimmer rising despite the cold of the night, the shadows in the courtyard orienting toward the altar, the way iron filings orient toward a magnet. The chanting was continuous now. A single, maintained sound that had stopped being a series of words and become a frequency. It had weight now. I could feel it in my back teeth and in the bones of my hands where they rested on the wall. 6 prisoners remained. I counted them often, not because the number changed, but because counting was something to do that was not screaming. Faris had not moved from where they had placed him. He was looking at the altar. His face was clear now. The calf's light was enough to see by, and his expression was not what I would have expected. He was not afraid. He was studying it, the way he studied a map before a mission, looking for the information that would be useful. He knew something was coming. He was trying to understand it. I had trained under him for 14 months. I knew that look. It was the look he wore when he was working out what could be done. And then the air above the altar tore. Not gradually, not with warning. Between one breath and the next, the space above the golden calf's open mouth was different. A pressure, a wrong that had no name, something pressing against the air from the wrong side of it. I had heard the sniper priests describe the experience of standing at a rift. They used the word wrongness, and they did not elaborate because, they said, the word was sufficient. The silence held. They were right. Nothing I looked at directly was changed. But everything I looked at from the edges of my vision was pressing in the wrong direction, straining against a surface that had no existence in the physical world. And in the strain, in the almost opening that was not yet open, there were shapes. humanoid in the broadest interpretation of the word, moving with a mechanical precision that no living thing achieved, in numbers that I could not count because counting required fixing the eye on a single point, and my eye kept sliding, kept refusing to settle on the shapes, kept moving to some other part of the not quite visible space. Yoke fiends. I had read the reports. I had listened to the sniper priests describe them. I had not understood, reading those reports and listening to those descriptions, that the word many was not an approximation. There were hundreds, an army, waiting to step through the gap in the world and land on the ground between this courtyard and the walls of New Antioch. Not a raid. Not a scouting force. An army, organized and ready, that would cover the distance to the walls before the dawn watch was half finished, and the walls of New Antioch had never been breached in 300 years, because they had never faced this. I was cold all the way through. I looked at the priest. His robes were clearer to me now, lit by the calf's intensifying light. And I made myself look at the patches and strips of material attached to them. I had assumed trophies, looted insignia. But I was looking at them more carefully now because there was something about the placement, the specific pieces chosen, that did not fit my assumption. Intelligence insignia. The patch on his right shoulder, I knew that patch. I had seen it on officers inside New Antioch. It was the unit identifier for the Signals Intelligence Section of the Duke's command staff, the men who coordinated information between the Wall Watch and the interior patrols, who knew patrol schedules, who knew the specific windows in the watch rotation when a section of wall was reduced to minimal staffing. We had come out through the sally port on the western section, which ran reduced watch between the 3rd and 5th hours of the night. That reduction was a scheduled part of the rotation, documented in the watch orders, known to the Signals Intelligence Section and no one else outside a small circle of senior officers. The Heretics had been waiting in no man's land for 3 nights. They had not stumbled on us. They had been briefed on our crossing window. I thought, even if I escape, I cannot report this. I don't know who gave it to them. I don't know who to trust. The information I'm carrying could go directly back to whoever provided it, and that person would know that their arrangement had been discovered and they would disappear before anyone could act, and the next window they sold would be the one that brought the army through. There was exactly one thing I could do that was certain. One bullet, one priest, one ritual. I turned back to the gap in the wall and brought the rifle up. He was still at the head of the altar, arms raised now, conducting the ritual toward its climax. 40 meters. Stationary target. The gap in the outer wall gave me a narrow angle. I had perhaps 15 degrees of arc before the wall obscured the shot. He was within it. I settled the rifle against the wall and found him in the sights. He was there. And he was clear, and in the light of the altar I had more to work with than I'd expected. The iron sights found him and held him. 40 meters was not difficult. 40 meters, under ordinary conditions against a stationary target, was not a shot I would hesitate over. These were not ordinary conditions. I made myself be methodical. I found my position against the wall and set my weight. The floor was not level, The rubble beneath me shifted if I put pressure in the wrong place. So I adjusted, distributing my weight differently until the contact points were stable. I moved my left hand forward on the stock and found the grip that gave me the cleanest sight line through the gap. The stone edge of the gap was rough against the back of my right hand. I did not shift it. I breathed. The silence held. I thought about what I had been taught. Patience is the first discipline. Stillness is the second. The third is the quiet moment, the instant between exhale and the next breath where the body is at its most stable, where the sights settle and the pressure on the trigger is an extension of intention rather than a mechanical act. The sniper priests called it a form of prayer. I had been told I would know it when it came. I breathed in. I breathed out. I did not find the quiet moment. The sights moved. Not much. A small drift left as I exhaled, correcting as I settled. But they moved, and I was aware of them moving, which was awareness in the wrong direction. Awareness of the sights meant awareness of the gap between what I intended and what I was doing. And that gap was not a thing to dwell on. I breathed in again, slow, steady. The chanting below was a physical pressure now, the frequency of it transmitted through the stone, and I was aware of it in my chest and in my hands, where they held the rifle. One bullet. I had time. The ritual was at its climax, but climaxes had duration. The priest's arms were raised and he was speaking. I could see his head moving, the words addressed to the altar rather than to the lesser priests or the gathered soldiers. And the rift above the altar was pressing harder, the shapes behind it clearer now. And that clarity told me the gap was widening, that the ritual was approaching its completion rather than its beginning. And I did not have the time I was pretending I had. But I breathed. I thought about what I was doing, and then I stopped thinking about it. Because thinking about the shot while taking the shot was the error the man teaching me had warned against most frequently. The body knows. Let the body know. The thinking part of you is slower than what's needed here. Trust the practice. I hadn't practiced enough to trust it fully. 3 years into learning a discipline, I had started too late, with a weapon that had no grace in it, working toward a calm I hadn't yet earned. I trusted it anyway. There was nothing else to trust. I thought about the priest, and what he had done in this courtyard, and what he intended to do. I thought about the army pressing against the gap in the world above him. I thought about the walls of New Antioch, and the distance between this courtyard and those walls, and the hours before dawn, and the watch rotation that a traitor had sold. I thought about Faris with his hands bound and his eyes open, still working out what could be done, even now. I breathed out. I did not breathe in. In the space between the exhale and the next breath, in the quiet moment, which I had not earned and which arrived anyway, I looked through the sights and found him there, clear in the calf's cold light, his arms raised very still, a man conducting a ceremony he had conducted many times before in the absolute certainty of his purpose. I did not pray. I had not prayed since my parents were killed, and the faith had not come back in 3 years of trying. But I thought of Nadia, which is as close as I have come to prayer since then. Not a general thought of her. I could not afford a general thought, could not afford the softness of it. But something precise. Her face, which I rarely allowed myself to see clearly because the clarity hurt. I let it hurt. I saw her face. I saw it clearly, the way you see something that is really there, and not reconstructed from memory. The shape of her, the specific particular reality of my sister, asleep in the tenement room in the Levantine Quarter with the bells marking the hours outside her window and the city walls between her and what was gathering in this courtyard. I held that image for one breathless second. I did not shake. I was still. I fired. The shot was good. The heretic priest went down without a sound that I could hear over the chanting, which broke apart the moment he fell. The 4 lesser priests faltering, losing their rhythm, one of them stepping backward and colliding with another, the pattern disrupted. The rift, already open, already straining with the pressure of what was pushing against it from the other side, began to collapse. The silence held. There was a moment, perhaps 3 seconds, when the shapes pressed harder, when the wrongness intensified and the gap tried to stay open through will rather than ritual. I heard something in those 3 seconds that I am not able to describe in terms that do not sound hysterical. A sound from the other side, from the shapes pressing against the closing gap, that was not sound in the ordinary sense, but that registered as sound the way a blow to the head registers as light. Then the gap snapped shut. The word for it is closure. The wrongness reversed. The air above the altar went from pressure to absence, and the sound was the absence of the frequency that had been sustaining it, and the golden calf's mouth went from cold white, back through gold, to the banked ember glow of something no longer fed. The heat diminished. The wretched scattered. They went in every direction, the perimeter patrols breaking apart, the handlers releasing the remaining prisoners and running. The heretic soldiers were slower, more controlled, more purposeful, and they were already looking for the origin of the shot. The prisoners moved. I watched Ferris stand, his hands still bound, but he stood, and he moved toward the chaos of the scattered courtyard with the specific quality of a man who has identified what can be done and is doing it. One of the younger prisoners, the one I thought I recognized from my unit, was close to him, and they were moving together toward the eastern gap. Run, I thought at them. Run fast. The heretics had found my angle. I could hear them on the lower floor of the building, working through the rooms I had worked through to reach the back. I put the rifle across my knees and sat with my back against the north wall and looked up at the ceiling, which had a ragged hole in it that let in a narrow band of sky. The sky was very dark and clear, and there were more stars visible than you could see from inside the city, because the city's lights washed them out. I thought about Mouse, and whether he had made it back. He almost certainly had. Mouse had an instinct for finding the exit that I had never been able to account for and had stopped trying to understand. He would have been back inside the walls within the hour. He would be worried by now. He had a way of worrying that looked like irritability, so people who didn't know him well sometimes missed it. I knew it well enough. He would be sharp-tongued and restless, and he would be moving around whatever room he was in, as though motion itself was a form of protest against my continued absence. That was fine. Mouse worried efficiently. It did not change anything, but it was something to hold on to in the dark of a building with heretics on the stairs. The image of Mouse, pacing, alive, inside the walls. I thought about Ferris moving through the dark courtyard with his hands still bound and that look on his face. He would make it. He was the kind of man who made it because he was already working out what could be done. I thought about the traitor whose name I didn't know, and whether the Duke's people would find them. They probably would. These things usually came out eventually. The intelligence community was small enough that an operation of this scale would leave traces, and the failure of the summoning would narrow the search. The traitor had risked a great deal for something that had not succeeded. That was the kind of loss, and that made people careless. I thought about Nadia, asleep in the Levantine quarter, the bells counting the hours outside her window. I thought about the walls of New Antioch, still standing. 300 years of stone, and faith, and maintenance, and the particular stubbornness of people who had decided that this is where we stop. The heretics were on the stairs. 1 bullet. It had been enough. The walls were standing. Nadia was asleep inside them. I waited. The silence held.